Thank you, Francis. Thank you to the organizers, and in particular, Dr. Paul Greenhoff, for the invite to be here. It's an honor to share the stage with a number of distinguished speakers. This is certainly an area, I think, where we can learn a bit from the athletes. This is Kalle Hyman, the Finnish runner, winning the 5,000 meters at the 1912 Games in Stockholm. Mike Joyner gave a very nice historical overview last night, mentioning how a number of athletes through the years have incorporated interval training. And this is a quote from his coach at the time. And you know, I think in many ways, sometimes over the last 100 years, we've just reinvented the wheel a little bit here. Certainly, if you look at the science of interval training, it took about 5 decades until the first scientific papers started to appear. Great work by Scandinavians, including Bengt Saltin, one of my mentors. This is actually Bengt's first publication, was devoted to interval training. Of course, in the late 50s as well, there was some good work being done by German physiologists, medical physicians as well, that Mike alluded to. And so I guess my job is really to try and capture in 20 minutes or so some new insights around interval training. If you look at the scientific history, it sort of comes in and out of flavor, but certainly over the last decade or so, there's been an explosion of research in this area, and so it was quite difficult actually trying to pull together the talk. Invariably, you're going to offend someone, so my disclaimer from the outset is if I don't cite your research, my apologies, but we'll do the best we can in the next 20 minutes or so. Really, I'd like to make 2 points. If I could summarize what I would like to try to say to you, or summarize the research over the last little while, I think you could fairly make these 2 points. The first is the apples-to-apples comparison. So if you compare a given dose, depending how you match that based on total work, total energy expenditure, I think there's now pretty compelling data that intensity is important. And if you have this matched work comparison, that interval training elicits physiological adaptations that are superior to continuous moderate intensity training, again when the dose is matched. For a lot of people, they're more interested in the apples to oranges comparison, and that's if we compare a surprisingly small dose of interval type exercise as compared to more traditional endurance training. Again, I think there's pretty compelling data, at least over the short term, a couple weeks up to a couple of months, that interval training can lead to similar adaptations despite a significantly lower training time commitment and total work. Thought it's helpful to start with terminology as well. If you get into the literature, there's a myriad of different terms that have been used to describe interval training, which is basically alternating periods of relatively intense effort separated by periods of recovery. This is from, well, there's been a number of recent papers devoted to this, but we'd like to suggest people adopt the terminology employed by Weston and co-workers, which was proposed a couple of years ago. So if you just look at a simple schematic of power output, and if we normalize power output or work max to peak work that you could do during a VO2 max or VO2 peak test, moderate intensity continuous training, or MICT, is pretty easy, of course, and that's just prolonged steady state exercise at a sub-maximal pace. One type of interval training looks like this. This would be an example of the apples-to-apples comparison. This would be the type of protocol that's been used a lot in Norway. For example, 4-minute intervals with a few minutes of recovery at an intense but sub-maximal pace. We define this, and it's been broadly defined as high-intensity interval training. And so this refers to relatively intense but submaximal efforts that elicit somewhere above 80% of maximal heart rate or so. As I've indicated, there's been a lot of work over the last decade, much of it from the group in Norway, looking at this type of apples-to-apples comparison. In the interest of time, I won't have time to go through all of the studies on this, but this is a nice review that they published in British Journal of Sports Medicine towards the end of 2014. And it's a meta-analysis of approximately 10 studies that had been done at various centers in Norway, where they had used their standardized interval training protocol and compared it to moderate intensity continuous training. And you can see all of the variables that in their hands, at least, they see occurring to a greater extent with intervals compared to continuous training, both physiological parameters as well as health-related indices and even some behavioral or psychosocial measures as well. And so their bottom line from this work is that interval training has more physiological benefits. And again, all of these studies were conducted in individuals with lifestyle-induced cardiometabolic disease, type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease. So the question comes up around safety a fair bit, and certainly there's been a number of high-profile media cases, including in the UK and elsewhere, where adverse incidents have been linked or at least suggested to be involved in some sort of vascular event. Obviously, we take our cues from science and not high-profile media reports. What is the science around the potential risk, at least when it comes to high-intensity interval training? Again, I would point to the very good work that's been done in Norway, led by Ulrik Wisløff. This is basically a study that looked at approximately 5,000 individuals who were involved in a cardiac rehabilitation program at 3 different centers in Norway. So these were individuals who obviously had an MI or some sort of cardiac event, come in for cardiac rehab, and either been allocated to usual standard of care, typical moderate intensity continuous training, or the high intensity interval training protocol that's utilized in Norway. Again, it was about 5,000 individuals across 3 centers. In terms of the individuals that took part in the moderate intensity continuous training protocol, there was 1 adverse incident, unfortunately a fatal MI. When you looked at the high intensity interval training group, there were 2 events, both non-fatal. And so the broad takeaway, at least from this research, was that the risk of a cardiovascular event is low after both high intensity interval as well as moderate intensity continuous training. There's been some discussion that since the high intensity interval training involves a lower time commitment, the risk is actually a little bit higher on a per time basis. But again, I think the main takeaway here is that clearly there's a risk to exercise, as we all know, but I think we need to put the relative risks of interval training in context. The other point that I'd like to make is, while I've said that interval training is broadly defined as greater than 80% of peak heart rate or so, it doesn't have to be. And so certainly there's more gentler forms of interval training that have been shown to be effective. This is a nice study out of Denmark that looked at interval walk training or continuous walking in a group of overweight diabetics. So it was a small RCT, very high volume training. These individuals were doing an hour a day, 5 days a week for 4 months. But the 2 groups were assigned to either do continuous walking that elicited about 66% of the maximal heart rate, or just gentle interval walking. What I mean by gentle is just slight elevations above that and slight dips below that mean value of 66%. So plus or minus 5 in terms of elevations in heart rate. And they compared it to a non-training control group. The interesting finding from this paper was that despite similar amounts of work, similar mean intensity, the interval training group showed superior benefits in all measures. This is change in VO2 peak with the control group in open bars, continuous walking in hatched bars, and the interval walking in dark bars. You can see that the interval walk training group had superior improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness. When they looked at changes in fat mass, there was a significant decrease in fat mass only in the interval training group. And then when they utilized continuous glucose monitoring technology to look at 24-hour average blood glucose measures, what you saw is that the people who remained sedentary continued to deteriorate. The moderate intensity training group basically tread water, and the interval training group was the only group that improved their blood sugar over the 4-month period of training. And so I think there's an important practical message from this paper and other work related to it. And that's that this type of walking may be a good option for individuals to consider, and physicians may want to advocate this in a primary care setting. It's a pretty simple message, rather than just walk at a steady pace for the next 2 light posts, pick it up and then back it off a little bit, and it would appear to confer some benefits over just continual walking. Problem, of course, is that people don't want to do this. And so much of our research has been focused at the other end of the spectrum, and I'm not at all here to say that this is the way that people should train, or we should scrap the public health guidelines or anything like that. These have started out as more proof of principle studies, trying to address the question of how low can you go, or what are minimum doses of exercise that people might be able to get away with. And clearly there's an intensity duration trade-off, but it doesn't appear to be a linear relationship such that very short, hard bursts can provide a lot of benefit. So coming back to the schematic that I showed earlier, if this is high intensity interval training that's matched work, the type of training we're talking about here looks like this. So very short, intense bursts of activity. This is deemed sprint interval training. And so what we mean by that is efforts that are performed either in an all-out manner or typically at intensities that would exceed the velocity or power output that would be required for VO2 max. And of course that's a broad range, even using that relatively simple definition. There's been a number of individuals, some in the room, that have been conducting similar type work. This is a study that we did, published about a year and a half ago in PLOS. The protocol looked like this. Because we were sensitive to some of the criticisms of previous work where we'd used Wingate-style training, where once you include a warm-up and cool-down, workout sessions are 25 minutes or more, and people would rightly point out that that's not that different from the lower end of the public health guidelines, at least based on ACSM norms or something like this. So we definitely wanted to utilize a protocol, including warm-up and cool-down, that was quite brief. And so the protocol looks like this. It's a 2-minute warm-up at 50 watts. Subjects then do 3 20-second all-out sprints. They're basically modified Wingate sprints, so 20 seconds on a bike at about 5% of body mass. Those are interspersed by 2 minutes of recovery, and then a 3-minute cool down. So start to finish, it's 10 minutes, and that involves 1 minute of very intense exercise. If we average the heart rate over the entire 10 minutes, it's about 86% of maximum, with heart rate peaking at around 95% or so during the very intense sprints. We looked at a number of measures in this. In the interest of time, I'm just going to focus on the VO2 peak data. But over 6 weeks, we saw about a 1 MET or 12% improvement in VO2 peak. And we were reminded yesterday in one of the presentations the importance of VO2 peak in terms of relative risk for both all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease. This large-scale epidemiological study was pointed to. And again, we all know this on the one hand, but I think it's important to remember that a 1 MET improvement in cardiorespiratory fitness is comparable to a 7 centimeter decrease in waist circumference, a 5 millimeter reduction in systolic blood pressure, or a 1 millimolar drop in plasma glucose in terms of the reduction in relative risk. So it's definitely not insignificant, this change in cardiorespiratory fitness that can be elicited by such a short, intense training program. So it does bring up this question of intensity versus volume, which of course is a long-standing question in exercise physiology. This is unpublished work by my former doctoral student Jenna Gillen. We're interested in making this comparison then of sprint interval training versus what is generally described in the public health guidelines. And so this was a 12-week comparison of interval training versus moderate intensity continuous training. The protocol looked like this. So we had a sprint interval training group that basically did that protocol that I just showed you. So 3 20-second hard efforts within a 10-minute time commitment. In terms of absolute workload on the bike, it averaged about 500 watts or so. And again, this was at an all-out pace. And if we sum up the total work, it was around 60 kilojoules. Contrast that with the moderate intensity training group that was doing 50 minutes of continuous exercise at a moderate pace, about 70% of their heart rate max. So in this group, it was about 110 watts on the bike. And you can see about a five-fold difference then in total work per session. So you basically had the sprint group doing 3 minutes of very intense exercise within a 30-minute time commitment per week, and you had the other group doing 150 minutes per week of continuous moderate intensity training. This is the change that we saw in VO2 peak. Moderate intensity on the left, sprint in the middle, and the control group on the right. Before training is in open bars. Midpoint assessment, or 6 weeks in, is in dark bars, and the gray bars is after the 12 weeks of training. Remarkably similar improvements in cardiorespiratory fitness in the moderate intensity and sprint group that was 19% overall. This is just showing the delta change for the moderate intensity, sprint, and the control group. Each dot represents an individual marker. Again, as Claude alluded to yesterday, no surprise that there's significant individual variability in the responsiveness to exercise, and that's demonstrated here. In this study, we also took biopsies to look at a number of markers within skeletal muscle. This is just the maximal activity of citrate synthase. Significant increase in both the moderate intensity continuous group and the sprint interval training group. No statistically significant difference in this case, and of course no change in the control group. Finally, in this study, in the past we've used relatively crude measures of insulin sensitivity based on fasting glucose and insulin or an oral glucose tolerance test. In this study, we included insulin IV GTT test, so infused glucose tolerance test to measure insulin sensitivity. We saw a significant improvement in insulin sensitivity, both in the moderate intensity continuous training group and the interval training group. No change in control. No change in body mass in either of the groups overall. So some suggestions then, I think, for the potency of this short, intense exercise to confer benefits in both physiological markers as well as some health-related parameters, at least in this group of sedentary men. We've also been interested in the potential to bring sprint interval training out of the lab. As I mentioned, most of our work is on the bike. These studies involve modified Wingate tests, which of course involve specialized equipment. And so there's some, we've been interested in some of the suggestions that you would have seen in the media. For example, is it better to take a long walk or do some short stair sprints? It's an interesting question. If you get into the stair climbing literature, like everything else, it's fascinating. There's a long history of stair climbing research. But we're basically interested in seeing if we took our 3 by 20 second protocol that we use on the bike and adopt it to stairs, what happens? So again, very simple. People previously had been doing 3 20-second sprints on the bike within a 10-minute time frame. We just took them to the local business building on campus, which has a number of flights of stairs. So on average, people climbed at a vigorous pace 4 to 5 flights of stairs, and then took a break and repeated it 3 times. This is the improvement that we saw in cardiorespiratory fitness with those 3 20-second bursts of stair climbing. Roughly a 12% improvement, or about 1 MET, which was remarkably similar to what we've seen before with cycling type exercise, suggesting that stair climbing at least can, short vigorous bouts of stair climbing can boost cardiorespiratory fitnesses as well. RPE, for interest, even though we told them to climb at a very vigorous pace, the average RPE was about 15 over the course of the intervals on a 6 to 20 scale. So it's challenging, but people aren't feeling that they're at their maximal all-out pace or sprint to save their child pace, as I sometimes refer to it. So I alluded to the potential for individual differences in these responses, which is always a bit of a challenge. Are you seeing changes because of the individual's predisposition to respond to the training, or is it the training intervention itself? And so we took a clue from some work that's been done in Australia involving single leg cycle training. Of course, there's a long history of single leg training as well, but the unique thing with this model is that it employs a counterweight. It's pretty simple design, but basically you utilize a counterweight on one of the pedals, which helps to return that leg to the starting position. So the bottom line is it feels very much like normal two-legged cycling. Obviously it's lower from a cardiorespiratory stress standpoint, but it basically allows you to make comparisons within subjects of different training protocols. My colleague Stu Phillips does this a lot using unilateral knee extension exercise to look at resistance training adaptations or nutritional manipulations. And so in some ways this model allows one to do that, again, using a model of cycling that's quite familiar, if you will, and certainly within a single familiarization session, it feels very much like natural two-legged cycling, even though you're only cycling with one leg. So what we did in a recent study, these data are by my postdoctoral fellow, Martin McInnes. They're unpublished at present. But we basically had subjects come in, one leg performed moderate intensity continuous training, which was 30 minutes at 50% of their single leg work max. And then the other leg trained in an interval manner using 4 by 5 minute blocks at 65% of work max. And both of those included a 5-minute warm-up. So work matched, session matched in terms of total time. The interval training is perceived as a little bit more stressful. These are the differences in heart rate. You can see heart rate slightly elevated more in the high intensity training group. Obviously overall values for heart rate are lower because they're only using a single leg to train. But you can see you're working fairly hard. These are mean lactate values just from finger pricks with interval compared to the moderate intensity continuous training. And so if we had people do 6 sessions of this type of training with one leg or the other over a period of 2 weeks, what happens? Well, we saw a training-induced effect in terms of mitochondrial responsiveness. This is just the maximal activity of citrate synthase before and after training, moderate intensity continuous training in open bars and interval training in dark bars. Main effect for training, so there was an improvement overall, but as you can see, the interval training group improved to a superior extent. We also included measures of mitochondrial respiration and permeabilized muscle fibers. This is a bit more of a busy slide, of course. What I'm showing here is the post-training data for the various measures of mass-specific OX-FOS. And you can see the trend overall with high-intensity interval training being superior to moderate-intensity continuous training with a few specific measures significantly elevated. So to wrap up, what are the potential insights for elite performance? As I've mentioned, I think this is an area where we're taking more cues from the athletes than we're necessarily giving them. As Mike Joyner alluded to last night, of course, there's a huge number of variables, as you well know, that go into performance. But I think a general, something that's apparent from the literature is that these adaptations that we typically use to explain improvements in less trained individuals, in particular improved peak oxygen uptake or changes in aerobic enzyme activity, are not generally the adaptations that we see to explain improved performance in highly trained individuals. Just to give you 2 examples from the literature, though, that both HIIT and SIT can be used to improve performance. This is some work that John Hawley was involved with, working in South Africa. These were, I won't use the term elite because I think that's a very specific term. These are definitely highly trained cyclists, though, who did 6 sessions of interval training over a couple of weeks. Again, this is more HIIT-type training. When you look at changes in performance, really this is the key point here is that after a couple of weeks of incorporating some interval training, they rode their bike faster. If you look at the adaptations within the muscle, this would be one of the rare studies where highly trained individuals were biopsied. So this is a related study by the same group. Point here is that there were no changes in oxidative enzymes, but when they looked at muscle buffering capacity, it was significantly improved after interval training. And when they correlate it to performance, there was a fairly strong correlation suggesting that it might have something to do with buffering capacity in terms of these athletes. It works in runners as well. This is work from Jens Bangsbo. Bangsbo's group have done a number of studies related to interval training and more highly trained individuals. These were runners who reduced their volume and added some sprint interval type training. This was their typical training pattern that involved interval training already as well as some continuous runs over the course of the week. They replaced 2 of those sessions with all-out sprints lasting 30 seconds with a few minutes of recovery. They included a large number of performance measures. This is 3-kilometer run time, but I could show you other measures as well. All of the interval training group improved, no changes in the control group. And so the conclusion then was, in these already trained subjects, you can stimulate further muscle adaptations that can translate into improved performance. Just my last slide or two here. You know, a clue from comparative physiology. This was alluded to in earlier talks yesterday as well. You know, it's fine to talk about short training interventions. There really aren't these longer term studies in highly trained individuals where the scientists come in and manipulate training over a long period of time. This is an interesting study that was conducted on thoroughbred racehorses, arguably the elite endurance athletes of the animal kingdom. 8 months of conventional track training for how they would normally train thoroughbred racehorses, or they added 1 weekly interval session for either 2 or 8 months. And so they had the horses run on a treadmill at a 6% incline that left them exhausted in 2 to 3 weeks. Over 8 months, these are the changes that you saw in aerobic capacity. I'm sure many athletes in the audience wouldn't mind VO2 peak values that look like this. They included performance measurements as well. And the takeaway from the study was that the group that did the intervals for the longest period of time improved physiological parameters, performance, and importantly, they did so without experiencing lameness, which I think is the horse equivalent of overtraining. Again, not to simplify matters too much. Finally, I think you know, my takeaway is just that there's a lot of good interval training research left to be done looking at basic physiological mechanisms. So much of the elegant work that was presented yesterday, I think applying interval training as a model and then utilizing or blending it with that type of physiological measurement will advance the field, as called upon in this recent review by Mike Joyner and others, just pointing out that we need to learn a lot about the exercise prescription and in particular the role of intensity and duration. With that, I'll thank you for the invite. This is my current group. We don't do a lot of research on elite athletes, but we do like to hang out with elite athletes. The kid in the hat is Adam Van Couverden, who is an undergrad in our program and multiple Olympic medalist and world champion in rowing. Thank you.